She was not supposed to read the newspaper. That was the first thing you needed to understand about Clara Marsh. It was not her newspaper. It was not her house. It was not her study, her parlor, or her breakfast table. She was 29 years old, and she had been a housemaid in the Ashford household on Society Hill in Philadelphia for 3 years. Her job was to keep things clean, keep things quiet, and keep herself invisible. She was very good at all three. But every morning, before the rest of the house woke up, before the cook started the kettle and the footman unlocked the front door, Clara sat down at the narrow table beside the kitchen hearth and read the Philadelphia Inquirer from the first page to the last. She did it in exactly 40 minutes. She had timed herself. She did not read it the way most people read newspapers, skimming the headlines and moving on. She read it the way a person reads something they are going to be tested on later, slowly, carefully. With a small pencil, she kept tucked behind her left ear, and when she found an article that mattered, she drew a thin vertical line in the left margin. Not underlining, not circling. Just a single clean line, so small that a person could easily miss it if they did not know to look. She marked 3 articles on a normal morning, sometimes 2. Once, in the 4 months she had been doing this, she had marked 5, and that had felt excessive. Then she folded the paper along its exact original creases and walked it upstairs. She left it outside the door of the study on the ground floor. That was where General William Vane lived, for now. He had arrived at the Ashford house 11 weeks ago with 2 trunks, 1 aide, and the particular quietness of a man who had learned that silence was a more powerful thing than noise. He was 42 years old. He had commanded the Army's Eastern Division through 2 campaigns that the newspapers wrote about in careful, respectful language that always stopped just short of explaining what had actually happened. He was in Philadelphia because the Senate had formed a subcommittee to investigate military supply contracts, and someone had decided that his presence at the hearings was necessary. He was staying at the Ashford house because Mrs. Eugenia Ashford was his late wife's closest friend, and because she had offered her guest room with the kind of warmth that made refusing feel like bad manners. Clara had seen him exactly 4 times before the newspaper thing began. Once in the hallway on his first morning, when he had nodded at her the way powerful men sometimes nodded at household staff, which was to say politely, but without really seeing her. Once through the study door, which had been left open by mistake, when she had seen him standing at the window with a letter in his hand, not reading it, just holding it. Once in the kitchen corridor when they had nearly collided and he had stepped aside without a word. And once at the bottom of the stairs, late at night, when she had been carrying a tray of tea things to Mrs. Ashford's room, and he had been coming down in a gray wool coat, clearly on his way out, and he had held the banister post so she could pass, and said quietly, "Thank you, Miss Marsh." She had not told him her name. She had no idea how he knew it. That had been the first thing that made her pay attention. The newspaper arrangement had started 3 weeks into his stay, and it had started by accident, which was the strangest part of it. She had marked an article on page 9 about the Army's Western supply contracts. The article quoted official numbers that did not match the numbers she had read in a different article 2 weeks earlier. She was not a military expert. She was not an economist, but she had been reading the Inquirer every morning for 4 years, and she had a very good memory, and the numbers were wrong. She had marked the article the way she always marked things, with the small vertical line in the left margin, and she had folded the paper and left it outside the study door, and she had gone about her day. That afternoon, Lieutenant Holt, General Vane's aide, knocked on the servant's entrance and handed her back the newspaper. She stood in the kitchen doorway and stared at it. She had not expected it back. She opened it slowly. Someone had written in the margins, not her marks. Different handwriting entirely, spare, neat, very small. The kind of handwriting that belonged to a person who had learned to say a great deal in a very small space. Beside her mark on the supply contract article, in that precise and careful hand, were 4 words. Notice this 2 weeks ago. And beneath that, 2 lines of figures. A corrected accounting. The numbers the article should have printed if anyone had done the arithmetic properly. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway with the newspaper in both hands and read those 4 words 3 times. Then she folded the paper, put it under her arm, went back to the kitchen table, and sat down for a long time without doing anything at all. That evening, she took out her pencil and marked 3 articles, for the next morning with more care than she had ever used before. She checked every figure twice. She read every sentence slowly. When she folded the paper and left it at the study door the next morning, her hands were entirely steady. He responded to all 3 marks. That was 11 weeks ago. She had not examined what it meant. She was a woman who knew from long experience the exact cost of examining certain things too carefully. Here is what nobody in the Ashford household knew. Clara Marsh had been to university, not officially. Women did not attend the University of Pennsylvania officially in 1878, but her father had been a junior professor of classical history before the money ran out and the position was lost, and the family moved from a comfortable house in Chestnut Hill to a much smaller one on the far side of the city. Before all of that, when Clara was between the ages of 8 and 14, she had sat in the back of her father's lecture hall every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon and listened. She had read his books when he left them on the kitchen table. She had asked him questions at dinner that made him set down his fork and think seriously before answering. He had told her once, when she was 12, that she had a mind that deserved better than what the world was likely to offer it. He had been right about that. He had also not left her anything when he died, because there had been nothing left to leave. This was how a woman who could identify a flawed accounting argument in a newspaper article about military procurement ended up folding linen in someone else's house for 3 years. The world was full of such arrangements. Clara had made her peace with it, but the newspaper changed something, not loudly, not all at once. It changed the way a room changes when someone opens a window, slowly, and with the particular feeling of air moving through a space that had been closed too long. The marks and responses had a rhythm now. She would read, she would mark. She would think through the afternoon about what she had written and what he might say. She would wake up the next morning already thinking about what she would find in the margins. There were rules, though she had never said them out loud, and neither had he. She did not mark personal articles. She did not mark social columns or society gossip. She did not mark anything that was not, in her judgment, genuinely worth attention. And he, in turn, did not write anything personal. He wrote analysis. He wrote corrections. He wrote counter-arguments. Once, beside a mark she had made on a piece about hospital conditions in veterans' wards, he had written only 3 words, which were not an argument or a correction. They were, "This should change." She had read those 3 words 6 times. She kept the newspapers. All of them, folded neatly in a wooden box she had pushed under her bed. She told herself it was because they contained useful information. She did not examine the other reason. On a Wednesday morning in late October, she had marked an article about a lecture series at the university. The article described a talk on the deliberative structure of Roman governance, which was a subject she had strong opinions about because her father's particular area was Roman history, and she had read his source materials as a child, and she thought the lecture summary printed in the paper had missed the most interesting point entirely. She had marked it with her usual small line. That afternoon, when Holt returned the paper, she found a full paragraph of response beside her mark. He had agreed with her on the first half and disagreed on the second. He had explained his disagreement in 4 tight sentences that were, she had to admit, well-reasoned. And then below the article, in the white space at the bottom of the column, he had added something that was not part of the response to her mark. It was a single question: the Roman governance lecture at the university this Thursday. Will you attend? Clara sat in the kitchen for a very long time after reading that. She set the paper face down on the table. She went to the scullery and washed 3 cups that were already clean. She dried them carefully. Then she went back to the table and picked up the paper and read the question again. It was still there. She told herself she would think about it overnight. She told herself that a general did not ask housemaids to attend university lectures, and that the question was probably something else, a polite note, a casual observation, not a real invitation. She told herself she was being foolish. She told herself she was overthinking a sentence written in a newspaper margin by a man she had never once had a direct conversation with. She went to the lecture. Of course she did. She told Mrs. Ashford she was going to collect the printed summary for the household library, which was true. She put on her good gray wool coat, the one with the small brown buttons, and she took the streetcar to the university, and she sat 4 rows from the back of the lecture hall with her notebook open and her pencil ready. She sat like someone who was there to observe and not to be observed. She did not look for him. She found him anyway, the way you find things you are not supposed to be looking for. He was 3 rows ahead of her and to the left, sitting in the particular stillness of a man who listened the way other people worked. Concentrated, focused, as if the lecturer was giving him information he intended to use. She wrote 3 pages of notes. She did not look at him again. The lecture was excellent in its first half. In its second half, the lecturer lost his argument in a single, badly built sentence, and the rest never recovered. Clara wrote a small bracket around the relevant passage and kept writing. After it ended, she was in the corridor pulling on her gloves when a voice behind her said, quietly, without preamble, "The subordinate clause." She turned around. He was 2 feet away in a plain dark coat, hat in his hands. No uniform. Closer than she had expected. His eyes were gray and direct and waiting. "The one on page 4, she said. He had 40 minutes and spent 12 of them on the Spartan comparison. By the time he reached the main argument, he was rushing, and the precision fell apart. He looked at her for a moment. "That is exactly it," he said. And that was how they had their first conversation. 20 minutes. That was how long they stood in that corridor and talked, while Philadelphia's academic establishment moved around them like water around 2 stones. It was the strangest 20 minutes of Clara's recent life, and she had lived through some genuinely strange ones. She had talked with professors at the employment registry who asked her fewer questions. She had argued with Mrs. Ashford's solicitor over a household account error and been less comfortable than she was standing in that corridor, disagreeing with a general about Roman governance, while students and faculty members stepped politely around them. He did not speak to her the way men of rank usually spoke to women in her position. He did not explain things she already knew. He did not simplify. He did not watch the room while he was talking to her, the way important men sometimes did, to check whether something more important was happening elsewhere. He watched her. He listened the way she had noticed him listen in the lecture hall, as if what she said was information he intended to keep. When she told him she disagreed with his reading of the Athenian model as a counterpoint to the Roman structure, he did not argue reflexively. He went quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a person actually thinking rather than just waiting, and then he revised his position mid-sentence and offered a better one. She had not been expecting that. She had been expecting at best a polite debate in which he was technically attentive but ultimately dismissive. She had prepared for that version. She had not prepared for the version where he was genuinely interested in whether she was right. At some point, she became aware of two things at once. The first was that Alderman Reginald Fitch was standing near the hall's entrance with two other men, watching. Not casually, watching with the quality of a man who was adding information to a list he had already been keeping. His eyes moved from the general to Clara and back again. She recognized that look. She had seen it before on other men in other rooms. It was the look of a person deciding whether something was useful to them. The second thing she became aware of was that she had completely forgotten, for the last 20 minutes, that she was a housemaid in a gray wool coat and he was a general in a civilian one. She had just been two people talking about a lecture. That was all, and it had felt entirely natural, which was, when she thought about it walking home on the streetcar, the most unsettling thing that had happened all week. The next morning, she marked the newspaper with more care than usual. He responded to every mark. November arrived quietly. The Senate hearings pressed harder on the general's schedule. Some mornings the paper came back later than noon. Once it came back at 4 in the afternoon, and once, on a Wednesday that she later understood had been a particularly brutal session of the subcommittee, it did not come back until the following morning, tucked under the kitchen door before 6, with a note in Holt's handwriting that said only "delayed apologies." She had not been able to identify precisely what she felt when she found it there. She did not try very hard to identify it. On a Sunday in the middle of November, Mrs. Ashford developed one of her headaches, which were frequent and complete, and which required the household to move quietly and the curtains to be drawn. Clara's afternoon was unexpectedly free. She went walking. She had been on the path through Rittenhouse Square for about 15 minutes when she heard footsteps behind her that she recognized before she turned around. She had been listening to that particular cadence on staircases and in hallways for 11 weeks. Even in civilian boots on gravel, a man who had spent 20 years in military service carried something in the way he moved that did not come off like a uniform. She did not turn around. "You know my schedule," she said. "Yes," he said, falling into step beside her. "I have been paying attention to it for 3 months." She looked at him sideways. "That is a very unusual thing to admit." "It is the truth," he said. "I find I would rather admit it than pretend otherwise." They walked. The trees had lost most of their leaves. The paths were empty. The sky was close and pale, the kind of November sky that made distances look smaller than they were. There were a few other walkers, mostly couples, mostly further down the path. She asked him why he had looked for her. Not in Philadelphia, she meant, but 4 years ago, after the field hospital. He had been a patient at a military hospital outside the city during the war. She had been a volunteer nurse there, one of several women who had come because they believed they could be useful. She had sat beside many beds during those months. She had said certain things to men who were very sick, to keep them in the room with her when the fever got bad, to give them something to hold on to. She had said those things to him during 11 days when he had been unconscious more than he had been awake. She had not known he would remember. He had spent 4 years looking through employment registries, household records, and social directories until he found her name in Philadelphia. He told her this plainly, without decoration. "You spent 4 years," she said, "finding a woman who worked in a hospital." "I spent 4 years," he said, "finding the person who told me to stay. There is a difference." She stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to face her, and his expression was entirely direct. No softening, no apology, just the thing itself. She looked at him and said the only honest thing she had. "I say that to everyone." "I know," he said. "You said it to me specifically." Neither of them spoke for a moment. A few dead leaves moved across the path between them. "There was a blanket," she said finally. "The night your fever broke, someone put it on my shoulders while I was asleep in the chair. I always assumed it was one of the orderlies." "It was not," he said. She looked at him steadily for a very long time. That evening, when she returned to the Ashford house, there was a calling card on the hall table. She read the name on it, Alderman Reginald Fitch. She set it down. Down the hallway, the study door was closed. Light came from under it. She went upstairs and sat at the kitchen table for a long time before going to bed. She did not sleep particularly well. 3 days after the walk in Rittenhouse Square, Alderman Fitch came to the house. Clara did not know about the visit until it was already happening. She was in the upstairs linen closet, organizing Mrs. Ashford's winter bedding, when she heard voices in the front hallway below. She recognized the general's voice immediately. The other voice she placed a moment later. Lower, smoother, the practiced sound of a man who had spent a long time learning how to be pleasant without meaning it. She stayed where she was. She was not trying to listen. She simply did not move, because moving would have meant closing the linen closet door, and the linen closet door had a hinge that squeaked, and drawing attention to herself while powerful men held private conversations was not something Clara Marsh did. She could not hear the words. She heard the shape of them. The general's voice was short and flat. Fitch's voice was long and circular, the way a person speaks when they are approaching a point from every possible direction, except the direct one. After about 10 minutes, the front door opened and closed. She finished with the linen and went downstairs. Holt was in the corridor near the study, holding a leather document case and looking at the wall in the careful way of a young officer who had just witnessed something and was choosing not to have an opinion about it. "Miss Marsh," he said. "Lieutenant," she said, and kept walking. The newspaper the next morning contained an editorial. It was on page 3, which was unusual for an editorial, and it had Fitch's name attached to it. It was about military procurement oversight and the proper role of outside review committees. It was written in the careful, layered language of a man making a political argument while pretending to make an informational one. She read it twice. She marked it. When the paper came back that afternoon, there was a single line beside her mark on the Fitch editorial. He wrote, "He has been building this argument for 6 weeks. Today was not the beginning." She read that sentence 4 times. Then, below her mark, in the small space at the bottom of the column, he had added something that was not a response to anything she had written. It was 5 words: "Be careful of his wife." She folded the paper. She put it in the box under her bed with the others. She lay on top of her covers that night and stared at the ceiling and thought about what 5 words could mean when the person who wrote them had spent 4 years finding you. She thought they probably meant he was paying attention. She also thought, which was a separate and more uncomfortable thought, that he had reason to warn her, that something was coming, that Alderman Fitch was not a man who made social calls for no purpose, that the calling card on the hall table 3 days ago had been placed there intentionally, like a piece on a board. She was not wrong. The Hargrove Winter Gala was the largest social event of the Philadelphia season. Mrs. Ashford attended every year. Clara attended with her, in the role that had no official title, but was understood by everyone present. The woman who stood close enough to be useful and far enough from the center to be invisible. She had attended twice before. She was good at it. She knew which rooms were for standing and which were for moving through, and she knew how to carry a glass without drinking from it, and she knew how to listen to 6 conversations at once while appearing to listen to none. The general would also be attending. Mrs. Ashford had mentioned it at breakfast, in the tone of a woman mentioning the weather. Clara had nodded and continued with her duties. She wore her good dress, the dark burgundy one she saved for significant occasions. It was not fashionable. It was presentable and clean, and it fit correctly, which was all she needed it to do. She pinned her hair without looking at herself in the mirror longer than necessary and went downstairs. She did not see him when they arrived. The Hargrove house was 3 floors of large rooms and 280 guests, which meant the kind of crowd that rearranged itself continuously, and finding any specific person required either luck or intention. She was not looking for him. She was near the East Corridor at 9 o'clock, waiting while Mrs. Ashford finished a conversation with the wife of a state senator, when a group of women closed in around her the way certain groups of women do. Not aggressively, not obviously, but with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this before. There were 5 of them. She knew 2 by name. The one who spoke first was Mrs. Constance Fitch. She was 53 years old, immaculately dressed, and possessed of the particular kind of social skill that made cruelty feel, just for a moment, like concern. She called Clara by her name. She said how lovely it was that Mrs. Ashford included her in these evenings. She said she had been speaking to the Hargroves about how remarkable it must be, the access that such a position provided. Then she paused, the way a person pauses when they have prepared their next sentence very carefully. "I understand you have been spending time with General Vane," she said, "in the square, on Sundays." The 5 women were all looking at Clara now. "We have walked," Clara said. "Yes, of course." Mrs. Fitch's voice was soft and even. "One can hardly blame you, a man of his position, and you in your circumstances. It would be natural to hope." She tilted her head slightly. "Men like the general have a kind of attention that women in your situation can mistake for something more lasting. I am sure you understand what I mean." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Clara stood in the circle of 5 women and felt the specific, familiar sensation of the ground shifting. She had felt it before. She had watched other women fall into the hole that opened up when it shifted. She was not going to do that. She looked at Mrs. Fitch directly. "You have mistaken availability for ambition," she said. "They are different qualities. I am sorry you find the distinction difficult." She excused herself. She found an alcove near the corridor's bend where she stood very still and counted 60 seconds, with the same precision she used to count everything. She had learned in the hospital that the worst feelings needed a container, a defined space, a known end, 60 seconds, and then you thought clearly. She thought clearly. Mrs. Ashford would hear about this within the week. The Fitches had the kind of social reach that turned a whisper into a weather system, and they had motivation. She understood that now. Fitch's visit to the house, the warning in the newspaper margin, the calling card, the editorial, all of it connected, all of it pointing in the same direction. Her position at the Ashford house had never been protected. She had known that. She had simply been comfortable enough to stop remembering it. The practical decision was clean. She would give Mrs. Ashford notice in the morning. She would write to the placement registries in New York and Baltimore. She would leave the newspaper at the study door one final time, unmarked, and he would understand. A man who understood the language of margins would understand a blank page. She straightened her spine. She prepared to return to Mrs. Ashford. She was 3 steps from the alcove when she heard his voice. He did not call across the room. He did not need to. He said her name, just her first name, not Miss Marsh, not in the careful formal tone of a man who knew his place, but in the voice he used when he was saying the true version of something. And the room heard it the way rooms hear certain sounds, all at once, like a note struck on a piano in a quiet house. Clara stopped walking. She turned slowly, not because she was afraid, because she had learned a long time ago that slow was better than fast, in rooms where everyone was watching. He was standing near the orchestra platform at the far end of the main hall. He was in full dress uniform, dark blue with gold braid, the row of service medals that she could have named individually because she had looked them up in a reference book after their walk in the square and had not asked herself why she was doing it. He had clearly been in conversation with someone when he turned away. Mrs. Fitch was standing 2 feet to his left, and her face had the carefully composed surface of a woman working hard to keep something from showing. The crowd did what crowds did when a man like General Vane decided something. It moved out of the way without being asked. Clara walked toward him. She held his eyes because she had never once not held his eyes, and starting now would have meant something she was not prepared to let it mean. She stopped 6 feet from him. Around them, the room had reached the particular quality of stillness that only large groups achieve when they sense that something is about to be said that cannot be unsaid. He looked at Mrs. Fitch. He looked at the room. When he spoke, his voice was level, not loud. He had never needed volume for authority. He said that he understood there had been some confusion that evening about Miss Marsh's position in the household. He said he wanted to address it directly because other methods had not been sufficient. He looked at Mrs. Fitch for exactly long enough to make the point, and then he looked back at Clara. He said she was a woman of clear intelligence and complete integrity. He said she had been subjected that evening to the kind of social cruelty that certain people used against those they believed could not defend themselves, because they calculated there was no cost to doing so. Then his voice changed, not dramatically, just slightly, the way a room changes when one candle is moved closer. That calculation, he said, was wrong. He looked at Clara, and something in his face, the last layer of the public expression, moved aside. "Miss Marsh," he said, and the room heard it, all 280 people, in the particular silence that had assembled itself around them without any of them choosing it, "is my fiancée." The word landed the way he had probably not intended it to land, which was everywhere, all at once, immediate and irreversible. Clara did not move. She stood 6 feet from him in her dark burgundy dress and understood, completely and without any part of her misunderstanding it, what had just happened. He had named a future she had not agreed to. He had announced a relationship she had not confirmed. He had taken the decision she had made 60 seconds ago in the alcove, the clean and careful and dignified decision to leave. And he had made it impossible in front of every person in Philadelphia who would ever matter to her life. She turned and walked out, not running. She had never run from a room in her life. She walked at the pace of a person who was not available to be stopped, through the east corridor and down the side hall, and out through the service entrance into the cold November air, where she stood against the stone wall of the building and pressed both hands flat against it and breathed. Inside, she could hear the low, restarting hum of a large party recovering itself. She did not have long before he followed. She knew that. She was not ready. She was also, she realized, not going to be more ready. She went back inside through the service entrance and found the east corridor and stood against the wall and waited. He came 2 minutes later, without Holt, without the public expression, without anything except the reality of him in the quieter version of his face that she had only seen a handful of times and had been trying not to keep count of. "You had no right," she said. "I know. I had made a decision." "I know that too." She looked at him. "You announced my engagement before asking me." "Yes." "In front of 280 people." "Yes." "That is possibly the most arrogant thing I have ever seen," she said. "And I spent 18 months working in a military hospital." He did not flinch from it. He also did not look away. "You were leaving," he said. "I was. I could not find another way to stop it quickly enough." She stared at him. "That is not a justification." "No," he said. "It is an explanation. I know the difference." A moment passed. In the corridor behind them, someone walked through quickly, without looking at either of them. "You wrote a warning in the margin," she said, "about Mrs. Fitch. 3 days ago, I saw what they were building. And your solution was to announce me as your fiancé to the entire room before having a single direct conversation with me." "I reached for the only tool I had," he said. "Public commitment. It is what I know. It is what I have always done when the situation was moving faster than I could manage through other means." He paused. The pause had weight in it. It was the wrong tool. She folded her arms. "Yes." He looked at her. Something in his face that had been held very carefully for a very long time was not held anymore. "I have been writing in the margins of your newspaper for 3 months," he said. "Every morning, because it was the only way I knew to say the things I did not know how to say out loud." He stopped, started again. "You marked that first article in September about the supply contracts, and I thought, here is someone who sees the same things I see, who finds the same things worth attention. And I should have said so 2 months ago when you came to the study door to retrieve the paper and I was standing at the window. I should have said it then." She looked at him for a long time. "The paper did not come back one afternoon last week," she said. "I was pulled into an emergency session. I left the response on my desk. I asked Holt to bring it. He did not come. He misunderstood the urgency." She took that in. One afternoon without the paper, and she had begun planning to leave the city. That was how narrow the margin had been. That was how little room she had been operating on without knowing it. "Go back inside," she said, finally. He waited. "This conversation is not finished," she said. "But you need to return to that room and let people see that you are not ashamed of what you said." He nodded once, the small, precise acknowledgement she had learned to read as agreement that had cost him something. At the corridor's end, he stopped. He did not turn around. "Tomorrow's paper," he said. "Whatever you mark, I will respond. Whatever you decide." He went back inside. She stood in the corridor alone and pressed her hand flat against the wall and breathed and sorted through everything she was feeling. The anger, which was real and not small. The exhaustion, the relief she had not expected to find. And below all of it, in the quiet underneath, something she had folded so carefully for so long that she had nearly convinced herself it was not there anymore. She was not planning to leave Philadelphia. She had been planning to leave him. Those were different things. She had confused them in the alcove because confusion was easier to carry than the truth. She did not sleep. Not from distress exactly, from the specific alertness of a person who has made a decision and is living with it before it is yet real. She lay in her small room on the upper floor and listened to the house settle around her in the dark and thought about margins. She had spent 3 months filling the edges of a newspaper with small pencil marks, and he had spent 3 months filling the space beside those marks with his thinking, and somewhere in that accumulation of ink and paper and folded creases, something had been built that neither of them had named out loud. She could see the shape of it now clearly. She had been seeing it for weeks. She had simply been very disciplined about looking somewhere else whenever it came into focus. At 5 in the morning she got up. She sat at the table beside the kitchen hearth, in the same place she sat every morning, with the same pencil and the same paper, and she read the Inquirer from the first page to the last. She marked 3 articles, one on the Senate amendment to the procurement bill, which had developed through the night into something that required closer attention, one on a piece about the expansion of women's training programs at a hospital in Baltimore, which she had been following for weeks, and one short editorial about the cost of public silence, which was wrong in its opening argument and correct in its final one, which was the most interesting kind of wrong because it meant the writer had arrived at the right place by the wrong road. She folded the paper. She carried it downstairs. She left it at the study door. She went to the kitchen and made tea and sat with it and looked at the wall and did not think about anything in particular, which was the closest she had come to peace in several days. Mrs. Ashford came down at 8. She sat across the kitchen table from Clara and looked at her with the careful attention of a woman who had managed a complicated household for 30 years and understood when something in it had shifted. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," Clara said, and then, because she was not a person who avoided necessary conversations, "I may owe you an explanation." "You may," Mrs. Ashford said, and settled herself in the chair, and Clara told her plainly, without excusing herself or condemning anyone else, the whole of it. 3 months of newspaper margins, the walks in the square, the blanket from the hospital, what Mrs. Fitch had said at the gala, what General Vane had said in response. Mrs. Ashford listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Constance Fitch," she said at last, "has been using that particular method against women for 15 years. I have watched it land on better protected people than you, and I am tired of it." She picked up her tea. "As for the general," she paused. "He announced your engagement without consulting you," Clara said. "He did. It was foolish." Mrs. Ashford considered her cup. It was also consistent. He spent his entire career winning situations that should have been losses by committing to them publicly before anyone could organize a response. It does not make it right. She looked at Clara directly. But if you know the man, it makes it recognizable. I am beginning to know the man, Clara said. Yes, Mrs. Ashford said. I had noticed. Holt arrived at noon, as he always did, and handed Clara the newspaper with the expression of a young officer who understood he had made an error the previous week and was prepared to face the professional consequence of it with dignity. She respected that. She said nothing about it and took the paper upstairs. She sat at the table and opened it and read his responses to all 3 marks with the attention she always brought to what he wrote, the particular focus of a person, reading something they are going to carry with them. His response to the Baltimore Hospital article was 4 lines long and contained, tucked between 2 sentences of analysis, the words, "This is long overdue." No elaboration. He never elaborated on the things he felt most directly. He wrote them and moved past them. She read to the bottom of the 3rd article. In the white margin at the foot of the page, below the last column, he had written something that was not a response to any mark she had made. He had written, "I should have asked you first. I am asking you now. The question is the same one I have been asking in margins for 3 months, and I would prefer to ask it once plainly, without a room full of people watching. Without a room at all, just this page and you reading it. Will you marry me? Not an announcement. I understand the shape of what I did, and I am asking rather than stating. This is me learning the difference." She sat with it for a long time. She sat with the anger, which was still real and not small. She sat with the thing beneath the anger, which was larger and had been there longer. She sat with the memory of him in the hospital corridor the previous night, the last layer of the composed face finally gone, and the words, "I have been writing in the margins of your newspaper for 3 months. I did not know how else to say it." She thought about the blanket. She had never known who put it on her shoulders. She had assumed one of the orderlies for 4 years, until he told her on the walking path that it had been him, barely past the worst of the fever, moving when he should not have been moving, covering the shoulders of a woman who had sat beside his cot and refused to let him stop. She thought about 4 years, the employment registries, the household records, the placement directories. A man who had fought campaigns he should have lost, and found ways through them because he was willing to commit completely before the moment closed. She thought about what she had said to Mrs. Fitch. "You have mistaken availability for ambition." She thought about what was true beneath that. She picked up her pencil. She wrote in the margin beside his question, in her own small and precise hand, the handwriting of a person who had spent years fitting words into available spaces. "Yes, but you will never do that again." She folded the paper. She held it for a moment. Then she did something she had not done once in 3 months. She carried the paper downstairs to the study door, and she raised her hand and she knocked. She heard footsteps, the same cadence she would know in any building, on any floor, in any amount of noise. The door opened. He was in his shirt sleeves, which she had not seen before. No coat, no uniform. Behind him the study was exactly what she had imagined from the outside. Maps on the table, books stacked with the controlled order of a contained mind. The desk with its surface of precise papers. He looked at her. His face did what it had done in the corridor at the gala, opened in the specific way of something that had been closed for too long. She held up the newspaper. He took it. He read what she had written. He read it once, and then again, and she watched his face with the full, careful attention she had been trained to give to the things that mattered. He looked up. "Yes," he said. His voice was quiet, a little rough at the edges. And I will not. She looked at him. She looked at the study behind him, the maps, the books, the desk where he had spent 3 months finding words in the margins of a newspaper, because he did not know how to find them in a room. You told me, he said quietly, that I was not finished. I did. You were right. He held her eyes. I was not. She stepped inside. He moved back to make room and closed the door behind her, which was not the proper thing, which was not the expected thing, which was also, she thought, entirely correct. Some conversations required a closed door. He set the newspaper on the desk with the same deliberateness he set everything down, as if it had weight worth acknowledging. She thought he might be the only person she had ever known who handled paper that way. There is a lecture next week, he said, at the university, the deliberative process of the Senate in the Republic period. I have read the description, and I have 3 early opinions about it. He paused. I would like to tell them to you across a table and hear you explain which one is wrong. Something moved in her chest. Probably 2, she said. The corner of his mouth shifted. The real version of a smile, the one she had seen twice in 3 months, and had been, she could admit this now, keeping track of. He sat down. She sat across from him. Between them on the desk, the newspaper lay folded open, her handwriting in his margins and his handwriting in hers. The 3 months of their conversation accumulated in the ink of it, visible and complete and theirs. Outside, Philadelphia moved through its gray November morning. The Senate hearings would resume tomorrow. Mrs. Fitch would tell her version of the previous night's events to everyone she knew. The social machinery of the city would process what had happened at the Hargrove Gala and produce opinions about it that neither of them would be able to fully control. None of that was in the room. In the room, 2 people sat across from each other with a newspaper between them and began, for the first time, to say things out loud. It was enough. It was, she thought, exactly enough. They were married in the spring, in a judge's chambers, with 2 witnesses and no audience. He did not announce it to anyone before asking her. She noticed this and did not say anything about it, but she noticed it. She marked the newspaper that morning with 4 articles, the most she had ever marked. He responded to all 4 by noon. And at the bottom of the last page, in the white margin, in the same spare and careful hand, she knew better than any other handwriting she had ever read, he wrote, "You were right. I was not done." She folded the paper carefully. She kept it. She kept every one of them